notice now that almost all of you are women, girls, female, few men, but the girls are more persevering than the men, I can see. In the previous 2 days, we've gone to a village in the remote Himalayas, and yesterday we participated in a little bit of their lives and observed what they were doing. People often think that all anthropologists do is just to live with people, participate, dance, drink, have a good time, don't do any work really, just watch. But in fact, if you are going to write anything worthwhile or communicate what you find, if you just do that, you will bring back only a few vague memories. You won't be able to write much. So today I want to talk about how you record a culture, and then how you come back from the field and write a thesis or dissertation about it. I should perhaps mention that in the description of recording, I was a very hard-working, conscientious and disciplined recorder of this culture. I already had a PhD in history, and I knew the value of writing and records. So don't be worried if you think, gosh, what a huge amount of work anthropology really is. Not everyone does all the things that I will describe to you, but it's important that you work out methods of recording before you go. Of course, everything has changed. You will probably now take a laptop with you and not do the kind of paper recording I was doing in the same way. Remember, if you do take a laptop, to be very, very careful to back it up in many different ways, and to send copies of your field notes and other materials somewhere safe. There's so many stories, even in the old days, of people losing all their paper records, and now it's much more easy to lose all your electronic records. So I now want to talk about how you record a culture. Now I'll start with descriptive material, that is diary, notes and letters. The central recording device that most anthropologists have found useful is the diary. How many of you keep a diary? 1, 2. Okay, well, even when you're sitting in Chengdu and doing your education, you should get into the habit of learning to keep a diary. My wife and I have been keeping a diary for the last nearly 40 years now, and if you don't keep a diary, the days merge into each other and slip by. But certainly in fieldwork, the diary is terribly important in a lot of ways, and most great anthropologists have kept fieldwork diaries. Let me show you first just a copy of a little bit of my first fieldwork diary. This was kept about 6 months into my fieldwork in June 1969. And as you see, I didn't keep very extensive diaries, but just enough to remind me of what was happening on each day. The top entry, which will be difficult to read in my handwriting, says, this is the 25th of June, a pleasant day, again overcast, but again little rain, and the villagers worried by this as it is holding back the rice. Bowen Singh's family all sick with tummy and head troubles and consequently short of labour. we went down to watch Prem and what has his wife's brother, Asalava, that is doing the summer rice planting. Very soothing to watch, and all village very friendly. Then carried on with Pinier, that was the Frenchman who'd written about this village, and we were translating his book, and the Tirige, that is the historical records. The next is another quiet, relaxing day. The chief sadness to finish reading Middlemarch, the great English novel by George Eliot. A really superb novel full of wit and warmth, and so on. So each day on the first fieldwork I would write a bit, and my first wife Jill would also write a bit. When I went back with Sarah, she became the diary keeper, and I'll explain how she did it. But this is a little bit of the diary for the 21st of April 1992, the first page of that diary. She is an excellent diary keeper. She keeps our home diaries mainly, and in the field this is one of her main roles. She does it in great detail, and I'll just show you. This is the diary entry for one day. This is the 21st of April. When you transcribed it, I typed it out, or she typed it out, it starts: to demonstrate the bugs in the water supply, Jerry fashioned a microscope this morning out of binoculars and a torch, with extra magnification from a few glasses he carried. We took a table outside, and Badra Singh was able to see the tiny worms on the slides Jerry made from plastic. Dilmaya also looked, but failed to see them. So did Puspa. Interesting to see what effects this might have. Wonder if the street cleaning, even to the extent of washing a road, is linked in any way. Alan did tell Badra Singh where he got his sample. That's just the first paragraph. Now, when typed out, that's the first paragraph, and that's the first page. This is the second page. This is the third page. The fourth. That's those 3 typed pages for one day. Now, how can one possibly keep a diary as detailed as that? And here I want to describe something which no one ever explained to me, but I think might be helpful for all of you, or some of you anyway. Whether you are going to be doing anthropological fieldwork or more generally in your academic life, the problem about a diary of the kind that I've just shown you that Sarah keeps is that it has much of the most valuable information. It has not only description of what went on, but your feelings, your analyses, your thoughts, your reflections. This is why a diary is so important. It's a way of, as it goes along, standing back and making comments, having ideas. It's a creative process, writing a diary, not just recording what's happened. And as a result, it's incredibly important. And if you lose it, if you lose your fieldwork diaries, if you kept detailed ones like that, it's a loss of all that time, or a lot of the time you spent in the field. So, for that reason, you should never carry your fieldwork diary around with you, and you should lock it away safely so no one can steal it, no one can see it, because it may contain all sorts of private information, thoughts on people, bits of conversation that shouldn't be passed on to someone else. And so the diary should be locked away or kept safely in your house, and certainly not carried with you to make notes in. What you can do you can do two things. One is you can have a notebook, quite a large notebook in which you make field notes. Or, and this is what I recommend to my students, you have something, this is a little Chinese, where we bought in China, a little Chinese notebook, something that is small enough to fit in your hand like that. And you carry this around with you all the time. I carry one around with me. I've got one in my top pocket here. All the time, wherever you are. In the field, it has the great advantage that if you're talking to someone, one of the difficulties that was mentioned is that people become very self-conscious when you're doing anthropological field work. People don't, on the whole, want you to make notes about their lives. They're quite happy to talk to you, but the moment you pull out a book and say, and look at them and start, as they're writing down what they're speaking, they become self-conscious or won't tell you as much as they would otherwise. So if you have a little notebook like this, and if you say to someone, I'm not going to write down everything you say, but if you say anything that is important and I'll forget, a specific thing, like how many buffaloes you have, or when you last went away, or the names of your children, or something like that, which are just facts which I need to remember. Do you mind if I just jot them down? And they'll say, well, that's all right. And so while you're talking, hardly looking at this, you just note down those facts, but also you write down the subjects you talked about. After a conversation of 30 minutes or an hour, it's very difficult a couple of hours later to remember what it was you talked about, or certainly at the end of the day. But if you've written down, talked about the illness of his wife, talked about the fact that his buffalo has fallen off a cliff, talked about, or you don't need to say talked about, just buffalo fell off cliff, wife ill, etc., etc. When you come to write the diary at the end of the day, you just go through that, and those are triggers which will remind you of a whole sequence of conversation, and you will have the specific numbers, names, etc. to put in. And here you see an example. I don't know why it's so light. Is there a reason?
Sun. Sun.
The sunlight. Oh, well.
Turn it off.
Turn off the sun. you usually manage to turn off the sun, which you do. It's just difficult. Anyway, you won't be able to see that, but it's just notes Haramaya thinking of moving village and going to daughters, of leaving village and going to the daughters. 7,000 rupees, that's up on the top right hand side for Bin Bahadur, 28,000 to get a house, garden, smalls, and so on and so on. Just very small notes, as you see also on the next page, down below here. So those two kinds of diary keeping are extremely important. When I first went to Nepal, however, I didn't yet have the idea, no one had told me of this idea. So what I used to have were lots of little single cards about this size, loose ones, which I would keep in my pocket. And whenever I met someone or I had an idea or whatever, I would jot it down on one of these cards. And here are some of the cards from my first field work. They've been sorted now, so these are all cards which I made at different times, but on the subject of marriage. I put underlined marriage, payments, wedding, and so on, to love at the top. And almost all of them are dated. It's absolutely essential in all field work whenever you get a bit of information from anyone, to write down the date on which you got it. So these are all dated, and it's also very important to write who you got the information from. That makes a great bit of difference. So at the top one, on the top right, is to love, is the Guru is Maya Taba. Maya is Hindi, to love as well. Maya Taba. May happen between men and men, women and women, and so on. Then there's at the bottom, wedding. Bowen Singh's reckons he will spend 8,000 rupees at the wedding. 4,000 will go to the girl's relatives, the other 4,000 on feasting. He has to give a certain amount of gold, and will give 5 tola of gold, and so on. The details down here. So the great advantage of having them on these little loose cards, of course, is that you can shuffle them around. If you put them in a book like this, they are contained. But anyway, these little notebooks we don't use. Once in the evening you have transcribed the material from there into your diary, then you just keep these, but they are no longer used. You then obviously have to index the diary. Here's a little film just to illustrate how the diary was kept, as Sarah kept her diary. And you'll see her, you can see in this, just at the beginning of it, there's the diary there, and she's actually transcribing from one of these little notebooks into it.
Most important of all the recording devices is the fieldwork diary, which has to be written up for an hour or two every day, taking the information from the small diaries, notebooks, and reflecting on it, expanding it, often interrupted by children. It must be done within a few hours of taking the notes. And this diary is kept very carefully in the house.
You can see it even more clearly here, the little notebook and the diary. It may take an hour a day to do this. It's absolutely essential. In fact, she's taken from a slightly larger notebook there, you'll see. That's the notebook. This is not in the village. It's when we're back in the hotel in Okra, probably. So the diary is both a record of events that occur and facts and things you observe, and also beginnings. It's just the beginnings of the final writing up of the events, because it's already you're writing down a few of your ideas, reflections, things you want to look into further, etc. are in the diary. The other really important, one of the other two important kinds of textual, extended textual recording devices are letters. Now, I'm really now talking in the past tense because none of you write letters. Or at least you don't write letters in the old-fashioned way of getting a sheet of paper, writing a letter and putting it in an envelope and sending it to someone. You all write masses of letters, but you write them as emails and on social media and so on, but you don't write many letters, I don't suppose. Do any of you write letters to anyone?
Yes.
Yes? A few old-fashioned people here. But in the old days, we used to write letters, and particularly, obviously, when I first went to the field in 1968, this was the only way you could send information back to your friends and family in England. And I have kept all my letters, obviously, of that time. And I realise now how valuable these letters are as fieldwork record. As I say, these letters are extremely important as a chance to reflect, summarise, make guesses, release feelings. I talked yesterday about the loneliness and difficulty of fieldwork. Writing is a way of dealing with that. In the diary you can let out your feelings. You can see this, the most famous anthropological fieldwork diary was written by the supposed founder of fieldwork, Malinowski, and when it was published, people were shocked because he was really very rude about the people around him, and racist. Now, you don't have to be rude or racist, but you can say in the diary, had an awful day, so-and-so was terrible, I hate it here, I'm very lonely, I wish I was home, and so on and so on. You can write it all in your diary if you feel a bit better. To a certain extent, you could do it in your letters too, although you don't want to depress your friends and family at home by saying you're very ill and having a miserable time. But you can talk about the difficulties. For those who've just come in, I'm talking about fieldwork recording, the way you record what you see and so on. And I've dealt with diaries and just diaries, and we're now on to letters. These letters can be extremely informative if you read them when you come back from the field, because they are at two levels, very distinctly at two levels. A letter is one of the most important historical sources because you are trying to communicate with another person. And therefore you put in a letter many things you wouldn't put in a diary. There are many things in a diary about your life you know well enough not to write about in a diary. But if you are trying to communicate with someone thousands of miles away, then you have to put in lots of detail to explain the situation and the context. And this makes letters very rich. You are trying to imagine yourself into the other person receiving the letter, and that is an art form which leads to very detailed and very vivid kind of writing, usually. I was particularly fortunate in my first field work and subsequently in that my mother and father had been in India for much of their lives, and therefore they knew quite a lot about the background of what I was going through. The sort of people I was with were people they had known when they were in India, and therefore they were both interested, particularly interested in what I wanted to say, and also knew some of the background. So they were very good recipients of letters, I also wrote to we set up, when I went to the field, a group of friends who were all doing field work in the same year as me, from the London School of Economics and the School of Oriental and African Studies. So about 4 or 5 of us exchanged letters. This was quite helpful. You could now do this obviously with email, because you could share problems and share findings and get comments and so on. Here is a letter written a few days before the first diary entry I showed you. This is on the 18th of June. The address is the British Library, Pokhara, but in fact this was just where our letters came to. We wrote the letters mainly from the village. We typed them and kept a carbon copy, because you never know what will happen to letters. So I in fact have both copies, the original and so on. And this is in the middle there was quite a lot about the life in England, which I won't bore you with. But in this letter I described to my parents what I was doing. For example, towards the end here, I'm explaining to my mother and father how I did part of the fieldwork, which I'll describe later. Inventories. An inventory is a list of possessions. I hope to collect 4 of these, 2 for rich, 2 for poor families. They are lists of property. I've only collected 1 so far. There are some 90 items, but I will just give you the totals of each section, value-wise. I'd be interested to hear how it compares to poorer families in England. Kale is a village in England at different periods. And so I give the totals a bit further down. Ornaments, £20, luxury articles, £8, agricultural equipment, £9, and so on. So I give a summary for my mother and father of what I'm collecting there, and discuss the methodology of fieldwork and my feelings about what is going on. So it starts sitting typing at the new table, which we have finally managed to have made after 3 months' effort. A burst of hot weather just before the monsoon begins in earnest, and ironically we both have coughs and colds. It is one of the surprising for me things about a society such as this. I expected a large amount of people to be chronically ill, leprosy, mutilations, tuberculosis, etc. But perhaps because I don't know the symptoms of more serious illnesses, it is the universal spread of minor illnesses, coughs, running noses, mild dysentery, conjunctivitis, minor cuts, etc., which are striking. And that was one of the things I wrote about in my thesis, that we always think of, at least I tended to think of these kinds of societies as ones where people would be dying young of really serious diseases. But the majority of pain in most pre-modern, in the sense of medicine societies, is just everyday things. Splinters, thorns, coughs, colds, leech bites, insect bites. So, as you'll see later in the medical survey, almost everyone has some minor thing which is wrong with them all the time. So, that's an example of a letter, and if you are doing field work, nowadays of course you will be writing and communicating with people in an electronic form. Be sure, if possible, to keep copies of what you send safely, because that may be the only record of your thoughts at the time. So store your emails and so on, because they'll be very valuable later. The final form of extended literary text which you create in fieldwork are notes and notebooks. These may be separate from your diaries altogether, but it's probably better to keep them separate. You can have everyday notes, which are quite short, but by extended notes, what I mean is when you go to an occasion where you want a really detailed description in words. It might be a ritual, it might be someone doing a complicated job, it might be an evening you spend with a family. And here, for instance, about 2 weeks after we arrived, we went to dinner with a British Gurkha officer called Lieutenant Bowen Singh, who later adopted me as his son. And so this was getting to know a very, very important person in my life. And my wife, Jill, or I wrote this long description of our evening with Bowen Singh. So this is just a description of what we observed, how we sat, what we ate, what we talked about, just on one occasion. Here is another example. I made these notes on a Hindu festival, a puja, the birthday, the 84th birthday of a senior man, and so it's called Sirasa Puja. And as you say, it also has diagrams of where we sat, who was sitting where, and so on. These are very, there's another diagram here. These are very detailed notes, but it may be that your notes will be shorter. Here, when we came back in 1987, I kept a notebook, and these are just short notes as I go along. For example, on the 8th of the 12th, 87, I put these notes. It's easier to see them in the database which we created from the notes. Here. Talked to the health worker, Udikansha, about village health. He goes around visiting each house in turn and talking to them about family planning, installing latrines and testing children for malnutrition. I asked how many in his 2,000 people person area had installed latrines of a very simple kind, that's a toilet. And he said only Bowen Singh, and some time ago another house. So only 3 out of the 2,000 houses had toilets. He said that returned soldiers were given tests for malaria and treated if found to have it, but there were no cases of malaria in the village. There were also tests for tuberculosis. He knew of 4 or 5 cases. They look out for leprosy, but he said there were no cases in the village. As for family planning, he thought that 40 to 50 people out of 2,000 in the village were practicing family planning. So that's a medium-sized note. And here's an example of taking notes during a ritual. This is a small village ritual, and Sarah, who you see here, with someone to give her some comments as she went along if she didn't understand things, is taking fieldwork notes. part of a funeral, and Sarah's sitting, a hot day, sitting under an umbrella here, and she'll take out a little notebook in a minute and start. Or here talking to a group of children and old men 8 days ago. Or at a wedding. So we're taking notes together there. Or watching another wedding.
यो कलाकार चाहिँ मुख्यको हो पहिले त अब हाम्रो गाउँघरमा मुख्य हुन्थ्यो अहिले तपाईले भन्नुहोस् त यो
Often you have to take notes in more difficult situations at night when you're having a chat by the light of, in those days, by the light of a torch, but of course now there's much more electricity than there was. You have the original taking of the notes, but then there's the organising of the notes a little bit in the field. The notes come in all sorts of forms and you can't put them under subjects. There were one or two attempts by anthropologists to suggest that as you were taking your notes, you could start to index them. Famous anthropologist Malinowski, I mentioned, suggested to his students that they take a set of different coloured pens with them. And if they were talking to someone about economics, they would write in green. If they were talking to someone politics, they would write in red. If they were talking about society, they would write in blue or whatever. This is clearly ridiculous, because when you're talking to people, you may switch from one subject to another, and if you start changing the colour of your pen every time you change the subject, it will becoming very confusing. And anyway, the whole point about these societies is that they don't split things into economics, politics, religion and so on. Everything is together. So in fact, you just take your notes in whatever form you like, whether it's a computer or handwritten, and then later you organise and index them. And here we are seeing, we're just working in our house on a little bit of anthropological organisation of notes. We have all the fieldwork photographs beside us. And I'm writing down notes after an event, reminding myself of the photographs. This is actually reconstructed. This was for a television series, so it's not a real event, but it's the sort of thing
Can we just get to some of the other portraits?
Yes. They wanted to show how anthropologists work, so I'm just giving a little demonstration, looking through some photographs.
Hold on a bit longer for me to just so you get a chance to see it. second.
He was there when I first field work and then continued through a number of occasions. These are some of the poorer villages. These were all photographs taken, almost all taken by Sarah. So you can see our workspace. Looking through the window, which I spent many months just sitting at this desk looking out through this little window at the hills.
Don't live in the room.
So that's just a tiny bit of the organisational. Right. Now I want to move on to other kinds of record that you keep. One is the census. A census is a list of all the people living in a particular community you are observing. You can have what are known as de facto censuses. That is the people who are actually living there on a particular day or a particular month. Or you can have a census of all those who would be living there if they weren't abroad on migrant work or away in another village on the day that you do the census. So it's clearly best to have a census of everyone who is part of that community, even if they may be away temporarily somewhere else. The census is a time-consuming document to create, but if you're going to do any serious anthropological fieldwork over an extended period of time in a community, you really must have a census. You must know what the population consists of, how many men, how many women, how many children, their ages. Without that, you just float around. You just don't know what proportion of people are doing this or that and what population you're dealing with. You can do quite a simple census. You can just go and find out the names and ages of people in a particular house, or you can do a more elaborate one. In my case, I did a very elaborate one because I was interested in population movements, and for that you need to know how many children a person has, how old the children are in detail, which children, the names of dead children, the names of former marriages, the diseases from which people died in the past, and so on. So I did extremely detailed census on my first visit. This is me doing a little bit of the census. And in the book I published on these people, I put the census schedule. So this is the de facto, that is how many people are actually there on the day that you go. So section 1 is how many people slept in your house last night, what are their names, starting with the eldest and including the person you're talking to. Are they male or female? What is their lo, that is the animal year of their birth. So you can work out, it's like China, it's a 12-year cycle of animals. So you can work out how old they are now. What is their relationship to the person you're talking to? How many years have they lived in the village? Where else have they, including residents abroad, have they been? Their rank if they went to the army. What is their lineage, or jat as it's called? Have they been to school? If so, for how many years? Can they read or write? That's the first part. And then there's the day jure, that is people who are away. Then semi-permanent absence, have you any close relatives abroad, and so on and so on. Then marital history. How old were you when you got married? Have you had previous marriages, and so on. This is the first half of the census. As you see, there are lots of questions. And in a normal family, with the help of a translator, it would take about an hour or an hour and a half to do one of those censuses. Here is a filled-in part of a census, so it's very faded for you, but at the top is the person who is giving the census, Saguna, or the head of the household. Saguna, a female, the year of birth, the age, 82, husband's, father's, mother, and other details about them, person by person by person, under the headings that I mentioned to you. This census, that's just one sheet. On my first visit I did 100 households like that, so 100 sheets. Subsequently with Sarah we've done over 200. It does take a lot of time. You have to walk to the house, arrange for them to be there or someone to be there, and it's quite time consuming, but it's formed the backbone of our subsequent studies, because each time we've been back over the 40 years or so that we've been studying this village, we have later on, it's all in a computer of course, then we could print it out, and then each time we went back every year we would update it. And here you see an example of a printed census with Sarah's notes on, in fact it looks like my handwriting, so Sarah does nearly all the census work. And we've added other things. We've started to add the amount of crops. They've got rice, millet and so on, little genealogies and so on. So we have a running census of one community and village for about 40 years. This would be one of the very few such documents in anthropology. And here's another example of checking it. Once you have this structure, of course, it becomes much quicker. Sarah, with an experienced fieldwork assistant, and we have several in the village over time, can go right through the census in a couple of days, household by household. Because Sarah knows and understands the village system and who is related and who is in what house, and has internalized, so she can, when she's in the village, someone can say a name and she'll say, oh, is he from house so-and-so? And working very closely with informants, they also know the names, numbers of the houses. So they have these conversations, oh, so-and-so from house 71 has gone to Malaysia or whatever it is, and can very quickly communicate and check. When we are away from the village, in England, we trained my nephew, who you will see later, to keep the census, and when someone died or got married or something significant happened, he would send us an email and say, Sarah, keep the census up to date. This was particularly important in a 3-year period when Nepal was more or less closed to us because there was a Maoist uprising between 2002 and 2005, and we couldn't go, so he kept the census up to date. This is just a little film showing actually taking the census, going around and taking census notes in the house. Hasn't had a baby. You have to catch people in the fields or wherever they are and ask them questions.
Birmaya aber mi tola. Woman sin. Ah, shit. I wonder what he wants to do. Din Mahadur Stoppeland. So SLC pass campus mode?
Or in a very poor household, this is a tailor household. You see the very small notebook doesn't frighten people too much. These people don't speak very much Guru. We didn't either, so it's quite a lot of communication using your hands, etc. So more census taking. And then this, I'll leave this as it's quite difficult to see, but this is the checking of the census with a knowledgeable villager, because once you've got all the census material, some of it is inaccurate, some of it's not filled in, and so you can do a lot of work just sitting at a desk with someone who knows the community, and a lot of time is spent on this, checking the census. So I said you can't really do anthropological fieldwork if you're going to do a proper study without a census. And you can't do anthropological fieldwork unless you do work on kinship and on genealogies. Kinship means how you are related, and genealogies mean diagrams and so on of relationships. This is because if you are working in such a community, almost all of them are based on family relationships. And therefore, in order to understand why people do things and why they don't do things, why they say things, why they work together, why they pray together, etc. You have to know their family relations. Also, in order to talk to people in the community, you soon have to use this kinship knowledge. People don't use names in such places. They don't use a proper name like Alan McFarlane. They would say the father of so-and-so, another person, father of Katie, in my case my daughter. And they have nicknames. And also, obviously when you're living, you don't address people by their names. You have to say uncle, cousin, younger brother, whatever. So you need to know how you're related to other people and how they're related to each other. So much of anthropology, probably about half of anthropological writing historically has been about kinship and how it works. Now, I knew all this when I went to the village, but I found it really quite frightening to start to study kinship. I think there were several reasons. One is it's a very technical field. Another is that in England, where the family doesn't matter so much, you would never go into someone's house and start asking them about their grandparents and their father and their mother and their names, and could you tell me more about your cousins and so on. It would be almost rude to do so to a stranger. You might do it if you knew a person well. But here, you were sitting down with strangers and you were asking them all sorts of intimate questions about their families and how they were related. So I found it quite difficult. And also, people are busy, they may not be interested in doing so. But I knew from my anthropological reading and manuals that this was very important. So I started to do it, and it turned out not to be too difficult. The first thing I had to do was to work out the names of relatives. You can't start saying, well, who is your father, your grandfather, and so on, until you know the kinship terms, as they're called. These are usually divided by anthropologists into two. Terms of reference, how you say, that is my cousin, that is my father, and how you say, how you actually talk to your father. Do you call him by the same term? And often in societies these are different words, but here they're the first ones, the most important ones are the same. So father is Abba, and you call your father Abba. Mother Amma, Amma. Older sister in Nepali, Didi. Younger sister Baini. Brother Dai, Bai. And son Sa, and daughter Tsamni. And then, because your relatives on your father's level, mother's level, are very important to distinguish. You mustn't just call them uncle or aunt. So you have Ateba, Ateba, that means big father, Amoili, and each daughter has a different name. Moili, Nani, Moili, Saili, Kaili, Laili, and so on. So your aunts you call Moili, Saili, and so on. You have to learn these and you have to note them down. Once you have noted them down, you'll find that they form into a pattern. This shows the way you term people. It's totally different and gets quite complicated in different societies. It's different from what I'm used to. I call everyone uncle, aunt, cousin, so on, nephew, niece. I don't distinguish between. And yet here they distinguish in the way that you see here. And once I'd found this out, I found that it's part of a famous class of kinship terminology, which was first discovered among the Iroquois Indians in North America many years ago, a system of equal parallel cousins, and so on. And this is the terms of reference. What you then do is you go from family to family trying to work out how they are related. And what you end up with, you can end up with, is something like this. This is only a small part of the genealogy of one clan or lineage, which Sarah has worked out, going back 4 or 5 generations and showing the cross-links between them. This may take some weeks or months to create, but once you have it, you can begin to get a mental map of the whole community and their links. We also gathered information about the simpler structure of non-Gurung people in the village, as there. You can find out this from talking to people. That's the main way of constructing genealogies. But you may also be fortunate to find historical documents in the community working. And we had in the village a village history called a Bansabole. And so with a few of the families we could go back much further. Obviously for the people themselves, these genealogies and kinship relations are important in many ways, one of which is, as with China, they have a great reverence for their ancestors and for a number of the rituals that they do. The shaman, the priest, will ask you, please tell me the names of your father, your father's father, your father's father's father, and so on. So you need to know this in order to perform the ritual. So constructing a genealogy is extremely important. And we'll give you some kind of mental map of the village alongside the census. The census is a cross-section in time. The genealogy is through time. The other kind of mapping is actually physical mapping of the village. That is, where everyone lives, what fields they have, and so on. And here we have one of my chief informants, an older man who knew the village very well, and who also had been a headman of part of the village. And as a result, he had been in charge of keeping the village records of land owning. Every 20-30 years there had been a survey of all the village lands, and this went back to about 80 years before I went to the village. And he's here sitting with a pile of these documents. Every day for 3 months or so I would walk down 1,000 feet to his house. He was crippled and couldn't walk. And sit with him for a morning, transcribing all the land records so that I could get an idea of how land ownership had changed. And this is, his name was Brikaras Gurung, and this is a page from the land records. You won't be able to see it very much, but it tells you the name of a landowner, how much a piece of specific field, the size of it, and which landholders were on each side. To the south there was so-and-so, to the north there was so-and-so, to the east so-and-so, and to the west so-and-so. So you have now a little piece of a jigsaw puzzle. You have a piece of land, named land, owned by someone at a certain date with the 4 people on the sides. And of course you then have a huge job, and this is the size of the land. You have a huge job in trying to fit all these jigsaw pieces together. Alongside these historical records was the records you yourself made. And the main one I made was a map of all the village lands and who owned them at the time that I went there on my first fieldwork. Here, I'm sitting here, the map is here, and the older men and knowledgeable people in the village are sitting around helping me make this map. It took some weeks to do. As you can see, it's quite complicated. They actually drew it. They said this size gave me the size of the field, which person, owner there was, House 22 owned this field, House 12B owned this field, whether it was a maize field or a rice field, going right down to the river. And this again proved absolutely essential. I spent a lot of time on this and the census because, as I mentioned, my interest was really population and resources. So in order to understand the resources, you have to know exactly the land ownership patterns in the village. If you were doing a study of ritual or something else, you might not need to do this kind of detailed work. But it's proved, again, extremely valuable. And again, once you had the original survey, land survey, each time we went back, we could update it as here, showing how the whole had changed, and also looking at particular fields or particular holdings of certain households to see how they expanded and shrunk and so on. So to get inside the economic world in the village, you have to do that kind of detailed work. You also have to, well, you can, and in my case I had to because this was my interest, you have to do a number of other kinds of economic surveys. I'll go through these quite quickly because most of you won't do this kind of detailed work. It just shows you the sort of work that anthropologists might do. Firstly, what I discovered was that many people didn't own the land they were working on. Many of them were lending land to someone else in a system which I'm not sure whether it's ever been common in China, which is sharecropping. Do you know what I mean by sharecropping? It means that if you let someone else have your land, then they will pay you a certain part of the harvest they get, a share of the harvest they get. In many societies it's half. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. Have you heard about this in China? Yeah. Well, particularly in rice cultivating societies, you let someone use your rice land, they work very hard, and when the harvest comes along, you go and take away half of their harvest, or a third of their harvest. And this was a survey of, in a certain part of the village, of who was sharecropping. I needed to find out how much grain, pulses and vegetables were produced by some sample families of different wealth. So how much are you actually producing on your land? So here are about 7 families, and I asked them how much in a year of rice, maize, millet, lentils of various kinds, potatoes, radishes, all the different vegetables they produced in a year. I also wanted, it's very important to do, for me, to do what's called an input-output survey. How much labour is put into a piece of land and how much do you get from it? And how does this change over time as the fields become less fertile or whatever? So this is the labour per unit of land, or rupani, in man days for doing rice planting. So manuring it, ploughing it, weeding it, breaking up the lumps, ploughing, raking, ploughing, making the water funnels for the water to flow down, flattening the land, sowing the land, scattering the earth, and so on and so on. All 3 people's estimates of how long it took for a certain size field to do all this, to cut the rice, to collect it, to bring it to the house, to store it in the house, to dry it, to take off the husk as we saw in the film earlier, and the total labour for one area of land, 15.5 days for this just a small bit of land to do all those stages. As well as the kind of dynamics of how much time and effort it takes, I wanted to know exactly how much each person owned. This was what I referred to in that letter I showed you to my parents about inventories. So this is an idea I had from my work on English villages, where in the past in England, when fairly well-off people died, there would be a list of all their possessions, inventories. So here I've taken about 7 families, and I've gone through each of them saying, do you have a hat or a cap, a vest, a shirt, a jacket, a sweater, an overshirt, trousers? These are male clothing, female clothing, long skirts, sari, headcloth, and so on and so on. How much roughly does one of these cost? How many of them do you have? So once I've worked out all the possible kinds of clothing, I could then go through with the families saying how many they've got. And here are the gold ornaments. From this, for instance, I could show easily that in 1969 they had this number of gold ornaments. When I went back 20 years later, the women had far fewer gold ornaments. They'd become poorer. You store your wealth in gold ornaments. These are luxury articles, guns and cartridges, razors, scissors, radios, and so on. So the inventory, as you see, is quite long. This is agricultural tools and household articles, all the things you sit on, you cut with, and so on and so on. Again, this takes some time, but without it you can't really do a detailed analysis. This is just a photograph showing you the typical tools, agricultural tools, simple tools that a middle-level family will have. This I think you probably had in China. It's made from bamboo. You wear it over your head when it's raining. This is a rice carrying basket. This is obviously a plough. This is a little hoe. So these were the sort of things which would turn up in the inventories. As well as this, I needed to know exactly what people did all the time. Now this is quite difficult to do. What I devised was a method of, the children are often very helpful, so I got 2 young boys aged about 13 or 14, and I said, I will give you a little bit of pocket money or some sweets or a present if every day you come to me at the end of the day. We'll have a chat in the evening, and I'll write down what you and your family did today and what you and your family ate today. So this is just part of, I did this for about 5 or 6 months. So on the 5th of April, the father ploughed for maize, the mother sowed maize behind the father, the oldest brother hoed up the old maize stalks, the first daughter hoed up the old maize stalks, the second daughter brought grass and leaves from the forest, the third daughter was young, and the fourth daughter stayed and played at home. On the Monday, the father washed clothes, the mother washed clothes, the oldest son ploughed for maize, the first daughter fetched grass, the second daughter herded goats, the third and fourth daughters went to school. So I had a complete overview of what 2 little families were doing for about 5 or 6 months. I also wanted to know how much cash was needed for our families, how much they were spending beyond what they earned from their agriculture. So I did another inventory of expenditure in Poker, in the sample villages. So how much they spent on salt, kerosene, chili powder, and so on. These are the items, and this is how much they spent a week on each of these items. There's not just expenditure when you go to the market outside the town, but expenditure within the village. So this is the expenditure on meat, oil, eggs, grains, doing rituals on about 7 families here. This was an idea I'd come across in a village study in Italy. The person had wanted to know how people were ranked in terms of wealth in an Italian village. So I took this idea, brought it here, and I made a 5-point scale. So very rich, rich, middling, not fairly poor, and very poor. And I went through with 4 or 5 families, or 4 or 5 people, how they would rank everyone in the village. Now at first they were quite nervous about this. It's not something you really want to talk about. You know, my neighbour is poor, my neighbour is rich. So I had to reassure them that I would never repeat this to anyone else. But because I did this late on, we trusted each other, they told me, and it's interesting that the assessments were very consistent. On the whole, everyone agreed who was very poor, who was very rich, and so on. And this helped me get a stratification of the village. Obviously, an anthropologist is interested in many other things than just the economic life of a village. For instance, here in a village like this, you don't have numbers on the doors. If you want to say, I want to go to so-and-so's house, you can't say, I want to go to number 1 or whatever. You have to learn the nicknames of all the houses, how they are named, and how parts of the village are named. This is Lama Nasa, this is where the clan of the Lame live. This is Kwanme Nasa. And each of the houses had a nickname. So this is a map of the nicknames in the village. I was interested in songs, singing. This is the words of a Gurung song. Kyuton le dukkamune basayulari. Drinking a lot is difficult. The year comes down. Koili yaba, koili tiba, nasayulari. And this is a song about the sadness of getting married. How do you go? How do you stay, my mother? How to go, how to stay. You can't stay, you have to marry. And yet there's a sadness. To another village. That house has no clothes, bedding none. Love speaking none, father, elder brother. And so this is a song about the sadness of marriage. So we tape recorded, we learned to sing a few of these songs and collected others. As I mentioned, as a demographer, I'm obviously very interested in health, and so I did a medical survey. I had the good fortune to get a local doctor from the hospital in Pokra to come up to the village, and we went around for a couple of days assessing what illnesses people had, not serious ones but small ones. So here are goiters. These are things, do you know what I mean by a goiter? When here you have a great lump under your... And these are the people with goiters, their ages, their sex, and so on. Other complaints, coughing, and so on. The actual survey by person is here. So Debbie Bahadur, this was done then. 1 year of burning in the right thigh. This person has rotten teeth, this person has cough and a hoarse voice, this person has a slight swelling on the left scrotum and a goiter. So this is part of the survey. Another interest was in children. Children, I mentioned, are very good for as informants, but they're also their point of view. They often tell you things that adults can't tell you. So my wife was trained, my first wife was trained as a social worker, a psychiatric social worker, so she was particularly interested in children. And so she did a survey of child rearing. How do our children brought up? These are questions, a questionnaire, and this is just one person's view on how you should bring up children in detail. What you should feed them, what you should teach them, and so on. This was the village school when I went there first. All these people now are in their 40s, 50s, and some of them have remained friends. Sarah and I went and visited this young man. Then he was a little boy. He was one of the boys who told me every day what his family worked on. And he later went as a labourer and a watchman to India, to Bombay, and we went to stay with him in Bombay, and then he came back and we met up again. So we still know a few of these children. And with the children, we did a questionnaire. What do you like doing most? And class 5, class 4, and so on, what they like doing. If you were given 100 rupees, what would you do with it? What are the most frightening things? Who is the person you like most, and so on. And these are a summary of the answers. We also set a prize to the children to write an essay on what things are you most frightened of: tigers, bears, thieves, evil spirits, witches. These I am very frightened of. I cannot see them all, but of all people, they are the most dangerous. So these are a few essays from the children. And finally, very quickly, religion and ritual. This society, the most fascinating thing about it really is its very complex religious ritual system. As I've mentioned before, these people came from northern China, possibly as a result of fleeing from the forced work on the Great Wall of China at some point. So 2,000 years ago or so, they came down Western China, through Sichuan probably, down through Yunnan, then across through Tibet, and then down into the hills of Nepal. And for those 2,000 years, they retained their myths and stories and their rituals. They have preserved better than any other society I have encountered anywhere in the Himalayas, that is in Sichuan, Yunnan, Bhutan, Sikkim, Nepal. They have retained their ancient rituals. So you have a time capsule of 2,000 years of ritual with added layers on top. So it's a very important society from that point of view. And I was fortunate to be able to record a little bit of it. So I've mentioned ritual, and studying ritual is the most difficult because you have to get inside the mental system. So all I could do was just the surface. So I took surveys of different kinds of gods and spirits. This is a survey of gods and spirits in the village. Which Hindu gods do you believe in? And which rituals do you do? This is a survey. But I particularly worked with this man, who was the ritual expert in the village, and his son. He's making a special magical protection which you stick on your door here. This is a woodblock print. He's making a number of these. And every day for some months I would work with him, writing down, and this is his son, and they are doing a religious ritual here. I would work with them to try and record as much as I could in my very inadequate language. And so here, this is various rituals that were done. I recorded about 70 or so. This is the name, whether it's been described by the other anthropologists who've been there, the purpose, how often it's performed, how long it takes, and the names of the various myths or stories they tell during the ritual. And this is the second half of that sheet. What sacrifices are made and the process of the ritual. Those are just 4 of them. This is the notes on just one of the myths. I collected about 50 or 60 myths. Altogether we now have about 200 of them. And this is in detail what the shaman told me about the myths. And this is typed out, the myth recited when anyone dies an unnatural death by falling over a cliff. It takes about an hour to tell. It's called Ama Toduma Pebode Kiaman Pianre Kamon Piaje Tukumon Ali Sadra Kudon Kwame Pala Mie Moi Pia. Here is the myth. It's told in an ancient language. No one except the shamans understand this at all. It's disappeared. Probably if someone did an analysis of it, they would find almost certainly some overlap with Nashi myths, and they would find overlap with some of the Siberian North Chinese societies, but no one has ever been able to do this. This is something that's just becoming possible as China opens up in Nepal. And I know that a number of people in this village would love to come to China and explore the roots of their origins. So at that point, you've been listening very patiently for nearly an hour and a half. So perhaps we can have a break for 10 minutes, and then I'll talk to you about some of the other kinds of recordings, and then about what happens when you come back in your field. So 10-minute break. Thank you.